Every podcast should start with you saying excellent.
Well, a lot of them do. It's kind of a word I overuse. So I'm well aware of my filler words, and excellent, amazing, love it. Yeah, those all seem to come up a lot.
Would you say that you take ownership of your use
I
of the word
take
excellent?
extreme ownership of my use of filler words.
That's awesome.
All right. Well, let's so we'll get started. Welcome back, everyone, to the Why and the Buy podcast. This is Christy Walters, and I'm here with my partner, as usual, Jeff Bajorek. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, I'm good.
Yeah,
I'm good.
I'd
like to start this podcast with a grovelly voice.
Sound just like
an
Jocko.
extremely, an extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? An extremely dramatic tone of voice. I'm going to set the steam for you. Hamadi, 2006. We almost got blown up. It sucked. I wrote a book about it. You should read it. There we go.
And it is that simple. Really.
I'd like to thank the Academy.
You should. So you know what, actually, before we get started, for those of you who are listening to us on the podcast or watching this video, we are reviewing Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. It's Leif or Leif? Leif. And this is a book that is incredibly powerful. And I have to say, and Jeff, I know that you mentioned this on a podcast a couple of weeks ago, that the process of reading and listening to this book really gave me a tremendous amount of respect for what our military has done for us overseas, and for a lot of people in these countries that do not have some of the same privileges we do. So I think a shout out to our men and women in service is definitely a necessity before we really even start talking about the book.
Well, not just a shout out, but I think there's some perspective that I took from it. And I don't know about you, but so my first experience with any kind of conflict, I was in middle school, and it was the early 90s, it was 90 or 91, and the first Iraq War happened. And I remember collecting the trading cards, right? Like, this was a spectacle. This was not something where we had to, you read about all the stuff that was imposed during World War II, and you had to watch your use of iron and metal, and, tires were being recycled, and food was rationed, and everything was to support the effort. And, the first Gulf War seemed like a video game to a lot of people, at least the way it was portrayed to me at an age where I was playing a lot of video games. And so that being my first taste of it, and then, the initial conflict over in Iraq in the first, 2003, 2004, you'd hear the stories coming back, and they mentioned it in the book, or maybe it was an interview after the book, but Jocko was like, yeah, we were like the Baghdad SWAT team. We were going on these little sting missions and operations and, doing good work, but it wasn't any real heavy conflict. But then when we went back in 2006 to fight the insurgent force, this was a well-trained military. And so I think that's the thing. And my respect goes to those who serve, because that is, it's an unbelievable sacrifice. But for me, I think what was most significant was the situation that they were facing was unlike any situation I had ever heard of them facing. And that was what really framed the concepts. And I think that actually framed the purpose behind the book, because it opens with, and if you watch Jocko's TED Talk, he's like, look, we went over and we made mistakes early on because we were not prepared. Because the people who were there to prepare us were not capable of doing so, because we had never experienced anything like this. And if you don't have that perspective or that lens to view this entire book, of realizing we had to learn on our feet, we had to understand what we were doing wrong and solve those issues before anybody died. And a couple people died, more than a couple people died, 100 people under his command, 100 or so people during that entire battle ended up dying. And that is, I think that gives the filter, a proper filter for the way these lessons were understood, remedied, and now taught around. And I think that is really what stuck out for me, beyond the idea that okay, I'm going to give my, I grew up at a time when it was like, oh, 2 weeks in the summer and 1 weekend a month. Oh, okay. I mean, like I didn't serve it. That wasn't my calling, but it was not looked on or looked at with the gravitas that I think it should be.
Absolutely. So joining us today on the book club, we've got Scott Ingram. Hi, Scott. How's it going?
Doing great. Good to be here.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us again. And we also have Tony Ryan. Hi, Tony.
Hi, Christy.
It's good to see you. And for those of you who have been listening to the Why and the Buy podcast, you have actually heard Scott's voice a couple of times in the past, and you would have heard Tony's voice here in the last few weeks as well. So they were both excited about this book. And I think both of you guys had read this book before we even decided to do this on the podcast. Is that right?
Well, I think I started this madness. So when I interviewed Tony on my podcast, he was talking about, Tony, you'll have to remind me what the other SEAL book was that you had read. And when I heard that, it automatically made me think of Extreme Ownership, which for me was probably the most impactful read in the last probably 2 or 3 years of everything I had read. So this was a good excuse to reread, which I didn't complete, but got... I'm motivated to finish now that I've been reacquainted. It's just such a good book. Tony, what was the one that got you on this adventure?
Yeah, so I'm reading The Way of the SEAL. It's Mark Devine's book, and it's broken into 8 chapters, each a bit of a personal epic you can take yourself through in self-discovery. And the one that I aligned Extreme Ownership to was a chapter on resilience and kind of teamwork, collaboration, how those themes intertwine.
One of the other things we also, Paul couldn't join us on this discussion, but we also had Paul Buscherel on this week or this month. And Paul is an ex-Marine. He was actually deployed in the Vietnam War, and he has taught a couple of small business programs around extreme ownership. He loves this book so much that the lessons are just super powerful, and they are multi-generational. And I know that we're in a generation right now that really hasn't had a lot of touches with direct conflict, but especially for Paul's generation and for a lot of people that have served in the military, it really does resonate in a big way. And the beautiful thing about this book, I think, is just that the way that they tell the story, and each chapter starts with the story of the battle that they went through and the lesson that they learned in that battle. And then it's followed up with how this lesson is applied in business and leadership. And I love that. It was very well structured. My ADD brain could follow it. And I thought that they did an incredible job of painting the picture of what they were going through and just the incredible amount of stress that you had to be under in those circumstances. I'm curious, did you guys have out of a top 3 takeaways as you were going through the book, either the first time or maybe even the second time? Tony, what about you?
I think the biggest takeaway for me, so relating it back to business, because it's kind of where this whole the whole investigation started, is the concept of using standard operating procedures, or what we would perceive as discipline, as a means to ultimate freedom, right? So building standard operating procedures across your team, aligning your team to exactly why a mission matters or why a strategic initiative matters, and then letting them work within the bounds as a more free way to operate in decentralized command. I think that was the biggest takeaway. So I'm starting to look at how to play that out across the team that I'm working with today.
And you work in a startup environment, so SOPs are going to be an interesting element to try and implement,
resistance. Right? Yeah, they're so highly resisted. Part of the sex appeal of a startup or a scale up is freedom to learn and freedom of choice and all the youth and vigor that goes into that. And you don't want to squelch that. You want the team to embrace that, because that's where most of the energy comes from. But the absence of standard operating procedures is brutally negatively impactful at times. And we've seen that specifically on my accounts over the past year, where maybe I own some SOPs, but I let the team kind of move and support me. And I don't think that's been a particularly strong way to enable the team. So I'm working with them actively and have been over the past week to layer in some new SOPs based on the reading.
I like it. I like it. Scott, what about you? What were your top takeaways?
Well, so I think Tony's was the one that I certainly had the first time through, right? The whole concept of discipline equals freedom. And it's really this idea of not having to think about the standard everyday stuff, right? And this is the reason why Steve Jobs wore the same shirt, right? He basically had a uniform because he didn't want to have to decide, what am I going to wear today? That's a wasted decision. So how do we keep our decision cycles available for other things? And so, I mean, over the years, I've tried to sort of build my own process about how I tackle my day so that there's not a lot of thought about that. And I'm freed up to give more strategic, creative thought to the things that matter, that really are going to have an impact. This read through, and maybe it was because I was thinking about you guys in this discussion, but I really came away with how much emphasis there was on why and communicating the why. And so communicating, just being simple about the communication, right? And the way that you need to communicate up and down the organization and the way that you collaborate. And a theme that I had heard previous to this book, but I think is such an important concept, is the idea of commander's intent, right? Where as long as we understand ultimately what we're trying to do, when the stuff hits the fan, as it always does, and things, when we're not able to maybe execute exactly what we thought we were going to do, at least we still understand the intent and we can use that to make decisions to decide, okay, well, given our new reality, here's what we need to go and do. So, you know, those were the big ones for me in kind of this go round. And it's the thing I always come away thinking after reading sections of this book is, my work is not life or death. You know,
yeah, there's
it
some real
totally
perspective.
changes the perspective on things. I'm never at risk of dying in the work that I do. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen to me? So like the level of stress that they're having to make these decisions under, I can't even conceive of.
And the consequences if things go wrong, right? I mean, it just, yeah.
It's funny, Scott. I had to laugh because you made the point about Steve Jobs and the shirt, and I was listening. This has sent me down a Jocko Willink wormhole, but I don't remember which podcast it was. But he's talking about, he's like, yeah, I get dressed in the morning. I have a drawer. It's a shirt drawer. You know, it's got in it shirts. I grab one. I put it on. This is what I do. Like it's not something I put a lot of thought into. And you know, so I laughed a little bit when you said that. But like, to me, this is a book. I think if you're building or leading a team, this is one of, it's on a very short list of books that you want everybody on that team to read, because it talks about the need for communication. It talks about the need for trust. The idea that extreme ownership means putting other people in charge of stuff, which is kind of counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. Decentralized command. It's, you know, leading down the chain. You've got subordinates who, need to understand what is trying to occur, what we're trying to make occur here. And they have to be trusted with those delegations and with those instructions. You have to lead up your chain of command. And you've got to make sure that you can justify what you're doing and why you're doing it to the people who are in charge of what your ultimate mission is. And then all the time in there about, okay, here's someone who's not in my chain of command, up or down, but we have to work together. And I've got to trust him. He's got to trust me. These departments have to be coordinated. So in a business setting, it's sales, it's marketing, it's customer service, it's engineering, it's production, it's all of these things. You cannot operate in a silo, even in the military, where it is assumed that these are droids who know how to follow orders. So they must be easy to manage because they are trained to follow orders at every cost. And it's, you know, Jocko says that combat is very similar to life, except it is at a higher intensity and a faster pace. And, you know, with Scott's point about the perspective and everything, like, okay, let's back that down a little bit. And let's say that the way that they do things when the moments are most intense, those principles are true. And I think this is to me, I don't know what the actual number is, but I say it's like a top 5 book. And what really resonates with me is that this book is about principles of leadership and communication. And it's taught and discussed in a way that is very, it's pulled straight out of experience with storytelling. Here's what happened. Here's what went good. Here's what went poorly, right? Here's what went well and here's what went poorly. Here's the principle at work. And now let's take that principle to work, and we'll tell you a real life story from the boardroom, not from the war room, and, you know, put it in terms that anybody in business can understand. Now, all of a sudden, how do you make an argument about how this is not applicable? How do you argue with this book at all? And it flows well. You know, my ADD, like Christy's, like just about any salesperson out there, you know, didn't kick in too much. Fortunately, I had a lot of snow to clear at the time when I was reading this book. So I, you know, got a lot more snow cleared and got this book finished pretty quickly, but it's told in a very compelling way. And I think that makes it more applicable. It makes it easier to relate to. And I put this up there with Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think it's almost a new generation of those and retelling of those same principles. I put it up there with, you know, Jeffrey Gitomer and the Little Red Book of Selling, these books that are about these foundational fundamentals and these principles that you can't break. They're applicable. Tony, I see you nodding. I mean, where do you put this among the books that you've read? Because I know you're a voracious reader.
It's a damn good book. I have a hard time rating them. So I'm reading like 6 in parallel right now, and they all are pretty good. But I was going to draw on one other thing. The reason I was nodding, there's the whole concept that culture can drive success. So if you look at what Toyota did for GM on the manufacturing lines, right, and pushing decision making down to the person closest to the problem, the entire concept's agile, right? It's the framework of what agile methodologies are, which is so applicable to software and what we talk about. But when you apply that to the military, I think that was probably the most dramatic thing that I read in that book, is how agile those teams are and how decentralized, and how you let, you know, the experts in any specific situation make the call simply because they're tied to that why that Scott was talking about. I mean, it's such a foundational principle to it. That concept alone and the way that it's universally applicable, it makes it a top 10 book. I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Christy, what's your takeaway? You've asked us all.
I did. Yeah. Well, I was going to get to it. I promise.
Oh, okay. All right.
So, you know, I really, all the things that you guys have mentioned have been fabulous. I loved the concept of simplification. I think that oftentimes, and this comes through even from a selling perspective, oftentimes we try to throw in so much stuff in the pot, and ultimately we bury the thing that is most important. And I think that was one of the things that they had a chapter specifically on it, but they really exhibited all the way through how important it was to get really laser focused on what it was you were trying to accomplish. So I think that was huge for me. You know, I should have prioritize and execute like written on the wall behind me here. That should be like my mantra for the year. I think that's something that I'm telling myself on a regular basis. And it's amazing how often, especially in the corporate world, teams are not doing that. They're not effective at truly prioritizing and executing. And I think it's because they're not simple. They're trying to do too much and be too much to too many people. So I think those were my big takeaways.
Yeah, it's what's really interesting, and I think this speaks beyond the book, but just to what's out there, is that you almost feel like in order to really stand out and make a name for yourself, you need to be able to understand complex concepts that other people don't understand. And I think you can only get so complex. And now it's almost as if the pendulum is swung backwards, and we're trying to remember what is at the basis of all of those complexities. And simple things like, hey, everybody on your team should have a common mission. If you're gonna all be rowing a boat, you should all be rowing in the right, in the same direction. And you know what? The same direction is more important than the right direction. Because if you find you're getting in the wrong direction, then turn around. And with everybody rowing in the same direction, you can turn the boat around a whole lot quicker. But the idea that it's, there should be good communication. There should be respect. But you can't get too close to people. The people that you lead, you can't get so close to where they stop taking you seriously, or you start treating them differently. When I was in college working in sports medicine, we had a professor who said, hey, here's the deal. You're going to have some of your athletes that are going to see you out at the bar or out in public or at a party or something like that. You're all in college. We get it. But you can't hang out with them too much, because you're still going to expect them to show up for treatment in the training room tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock in the morning. I know you're going to be there. That's your job. But if you get too chummy with people, then all of a sudden they don't take you seriously anymore. And that's something that has stuck with me for a long time. And I've had to remember that, not only with people on teams that I've led and worked with, but also, for some of my managers and leaders that I've wanted to get closer to, but couldn't quite understand why the barrier was there a little bit. And it's like, oh yeah, that's right. All of a sudden, there has to be a healthy relationship, and part of a healthy relationship in the business climate is not getting too close. I mean, think about how many partnerships have been ruined. Think about how many. I mean, in the illustration they give in the book is, well, we need to keep him around. He's a team player and he's done good things. You're like, his division is failing. You're keeping him around because you like him. Do you want the company to survive? And I work on this with clients all the time. Well, we just can't quite seem to get this person to fit, and he can't seem to get up to speed. How long's it been? 2 years. 2 years? What else are you going to throw at this person? It's time to tell them. They already know, by the way, that this isn't working. You've got to move through here, because your team's success is being held back by someone who doesn't belong on the team. Think about that. And, so, I mean, just the simple stuff is the easiest to comprehend. It's also the easiest to ignore, because we want to tell ourselves that it's more complicated than that. And this reminds us that simplicity is vital for a reason.
So Jeff, on the complexity piece, you were asking, where does it come from, or why the pushback towards simplicity as the value piece? It's ego. I mean, that's what I picked up from the book. So over complexity is either feeding your own ego, because you're so valuable and what you're doing is so damn important, or your time is so important you don't have the time to dumb it down to the least common denominator and pick your team up. And that was a huge takeaway for me too. I mean, I'm in a role where ego matters. You play a little bit of an ego part.
Yeah.
But I also, I hold the Midwestern value. I try to be as servant as I can. That's beaten into me by my parents. And, checking your ego is a huge takeaway. And the fact that it was so in check for Jocko in the way that he describes it was incredible, looking at his pedigree.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think even hearing Leif describe Jocko as a leader was interesting. It was interesting to kind of get the leader's perspective, but when you also had someone else who was, because I was listening to the audible version as well, when you also had someone else who was weighing in and telling stories from the perspective of reporting back to him. And, that was a fascinating element. How many of us would want to sit across the table from someone who's telling a leadership story about us? And what would that sound like, right?
Oh, yeah. No, that's an interesting thing. I mean, so when you look in the mirror, or when someone else looks on the other side of that, one-way glass, I mean, what are they really seeing? Yeah.
Well, and I think the other big theme of this book, while it is a leadership book, I think it's my takeaway, and maybe this is again just my perspective, and had a great conversation with an episode I just released this morning on my show, and we talked about leading from the field, right? I don't have anybody that reports to me, and I think one of the real keys of what extreme ownership really is recognizing that you are responsible for everything. right? So if you are leading a team, you are responsible for that team's results, right? You can't blame them when things don't go right. At the same time, we are individually responsible, and let's bring this back to sales, right? We're responsible for leading our team that is selling, and we're responsible for the result that nets. Things are going to go wrong. People aren't going to execute the way that we planned, right? But at the end of the day, you've got to look at and take extreme ownership of that ultimate result, and look it in the face, and, managing up and down and everything else. It's such an important concept. And I have a feeling like that's a reason why this book just catches fire, because for an organization to really take it on and adopt it and have everybody take that level of ownership. I mean, one of the stories that Jocko tells in the very beginning, he embodies this concept. I mean, they get into a situation where it's a blue on blue situation. They're shooting at each other, and it's all screwed up, and heads are going to roll, right? It's one of these situations like this is the mortal sin. We can't do this. So, heads are going to roll. And one thing that Jocko didn't point out, but I thought it was interesting, because he's asking, like, who's responsible? And it was amazing, because everybody sort of raised their hand and said, oh, it was my fault, I did this wrong. And it was my fault, I did this wrong. But the point of that story is him stepping up and saying, no, you're all wrong. I'm the leader. I'm responsible. So it's just that embodiment. And I can see if an entire organization or entire team takes this on and takes on as much ownership as they can, the results are going to be epic.
Mm-hmm. And leadership is contagious, right? So one of my favorite quotes from the book: good leadership or bad leadership, it's contagious. Whatever it is you want your team to embody, they're taking their cues from you. And I loved I loved that story. And I loved the story about the boat crews when they were doing the boat races in the school, that, they took the worst leader and swapped him with the best leader and had them lead those crews through the race. And it was interesting how the crews had embodied whatever it was that the leader had shown them before. And, if it was always someone else's faults, that was your go-to approach. That was their go-to approach. If you just took ownership and you said, nope, we are all in this together, we're all equals, we're moving, that was the team's approach. So it was fascinating and a little bit scary to think how contagious that behavior can be, because we're all susceptible to it. We all have leaders at different levels in our organizations. If you're in business for yourself, you still have leaders in your life that you follow and that you emulate. So there's a tremendous amount of power in that process, and a tremendous amount of responsibility that you have to other people to make sure that you're providing the right kind of example.
Well, and you've got good leaders and you've got bad leaders, and I've worked with and for both. I have always taken the approach, though, and Christy, you and I have talked about this, I don't get this whole leadership training thing. Leadership, you do it or you don't. Like, what is that? Like, leadership is just doing the right thing all the time. You either get it or you don't. And it has always just come across to me as being something that is just kind of intuitive. And clearly, I think that is also why there are so many poor leaders out there, is because there's not a great way. Well, no, there probably is, but I haven't sought it out because I've not really seen the need to, because I just think I've got this mindset that you have it or you don't. But this book gave me language. This book gave me real situations, real principles to be able to talk about. And I keep going back to this principle thing, but there's a lot of fluffy leadership types out there. There are a lot of people who write leadership books, and you go search a hashtag for leadership and you find all kinds of stuff out there online. And it's all like, you said a lot without saying anything. Like, how did you manage to use that many words and not get any salient point across? I see so much of that when I hear someone who is writing on leadership, or they're a leadership expert or whatever, like, I'm so hesitant to call myself a leadership expert, because I'm so like, I'm afraid to be associated with some of the people who call themselves that. And Christy, I know you, so I'm not afraid to call you a leadership expert because I recognize you as one.
You know,
You're
I was
one of
about
the
to bounce
haves.
all over that, right?
Oh yeah, I had to make sure I ducked and covered before I gave you the microphone back. But like, so much of that's out there. I'm like, okay, I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
I'm great with it when it's there. But like, it's too simple to even try to define or talk about. And that's what we talked about, Christy. And then I read this book and I'm like, oh, all right, I get it. Here we go. I have language now. It's
It
the same
is
way
true.
I felt. It's the same way I felt. And Scott, you and I talked about this. It's the same way I felt when I read Challenger. Now that's a different book and I don't think we'll even get to it in the book club this year, but you know, the idea that here's language to help people explain to me what I've just kind of taken as intuitive all along and then not realized that it's not intuitive. This is something that you have to have some sort of tools to acquire if you don't have it intuitively. And it's not a have or have not yet. It's a have or I don't have it yet kind of situation. And so that's what I think is most resonant about this with me is it gives me the language to talk about. And I've tried not to let recency bias and confirmation bias enter my realm too closely, but I find myself, I mean, with this stuff on my mind a lot and now applying it in a lot of different ways with clients that I'm working with now because it's so appropriate.
Right. And well, and here's the reality. So this is my little soapbox on kind of both leadership and sales training. I mean, several of us are sales trainers. It is very obvious if you have lived and been immersed in it most of your career. And what comes easy for you is going to be a challenge for someone else. And training of any sort is really about reinforcing methods, and it is about reinforcing language. And we get a little bit better every single time. So I think leadership training is just as valuable as sales training is to an organization. And it's because it's the reason coaches have the practices that they do today. We forget in the heat of the moment. And again, Scott, you said this isn't life or death. Most of us don't have life or death jobs, but we still forget in the moment how to be a good leader. And every now and then, things like books, this discussion, podcasts, anything that you do to continually learn just reinforces and gives you that reminder to come back to the things that are really sacred. And I think that's where sales training, I think that's where leadership training comes into play. And it's not, there certainly are, it's not, there are happiness experts out there. And I know a few happiness experts, actually. I love them. They're very happy people. But, it's very, there are a lot of fluffy programs out there that are just masquerading. They're taking very basic tenets and they're masquerading as something else. But the reality is we all have to be reminded. We have to be reminded on, what makes a good leader, what makes a good, solid salesperson, and how do we incorporate that in the example that we set for others.
And I want to clarify one thing, because I think leadership training is very vital. I just always saw it as an internship program, not a curriculum program. How do you distill leadership into a book?
It's a cultivation program, right?
Right. How do you distill leadership into a book? You teach leadership by being a great leader and making sure that other people who want to be great leaders can see that and understand what leadership looks like. That takes years and years and years and years. You're going to put it in a 400-page book? What are you going to put in there? They did it. So for me, it was, very, to a certain extent, certainly egocentric and like, okay, what are you going to teach me? Like I've been living leadership my entire life for years and years, stepping into roles that I wasn't prepared for, knowing that I would come out on the other side better for it. That's leadership. Doing the right thing all the time. That's leadership, even when it's tough. You can't put my 38 years into a book. That's too long of a book. Hell, I can't even write that book, right? So for me, it was really just a disconnect of how that could be consolidated. And they did a brilliant job of it. And that's what I love most about it.
They really did.
So what are you guys going to implement as a result of having read this book? We'll start with Scott because he's got that grin on his face.
So, the thing that's top of mind for me right now is we're looking at our just kind of overall account management process. So, how do we, and I had an incredible conversation yesterday with my boss about really just jointly. This started as how do we better build sort of an account plan and codify the way that we're working with our clients between the account manager and the services lead, right? I work for a professional services organization. So, these are consultants. And what we ultimately came to as we were sort of outlining and thinking about what's the kind of one-page result, right? Because we want this to be simple, right? I don't want to create and waste a bunch of time creating a 5 to 10 page document that nobody's ever going to read again. And it's just an exercise in futility. And we actually came to the place where can we make this, it started as, can we make this completely public and shareable with our client? And then it turned into, wait a minute, why aren't we building this with them as well? And so, it's all of those things. It's defining the why. It's defining the intent. It's the collaboration. It's the communication and the cadence and the way that you just continue to iterate and improve. And, when you're in sales, you are leading these relationships. And so you have to take extreme ownership of that and of those results. So that's kind of the very active thing that's on my plate right now that we're taking on and seeing really incredible progress. I'm excited about it.
That's cool. What about you,
I'm excited to battle test it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, that's, anytime you get something, that's a great way to look at it. Cause you get this new idea and you want to implement it, but then you don't know how it's going to work. So to actually, all right, we're going to do this. Are we really going to do this? Yeah, we're really going to do this. Okay, let's do it. And now you're in the thick of it. And that's awesome. So what about you, Tony?
So actually super germane. Scott and I live in a similar universe, right? I strategic account executive for, the accounts I run. So I split account management and selling. And tomorrow I sit down with my team of 8 dotted lines and we're going to go through for one of my Fortune 100s, the why. So why is this account important to us? What are we doing for it over the course of this year? We have 7 goals, myself and the account manager outlined. And we're going to try to stop there. So the model I use is I use SWOT for everything, just to break down where things live and put it into a TOES model. But we're physically going through it, and I'm going to allow the members of my team to do the goal setting and strategic work. So a little bit decentralized, trying to get them up, tie them to that why, get them bought into what we're doing. So it's a little bit of the battle testing Scott was just talking about. That was number one. And then number 2, I think Christy and Jeff and I, we talked about this last time I was on the call. I do a daily recap every day, right? A little debrief of what I learned, but very rarely do we enforce debriefs on, I guess the word would be the strategic missions that we're running internal at Octave. So we're trying to implement sort of a twofold debrief. The first is the team itself, and then the second layer is pulling in a couple of different eyes, folks who don't live on those accounts that are, whether they're from our engineering team or our client services team, someone wholly separated from these accounts to come in and actually critique and judge what we came up with to try to drive a little further learning. So elements of inclusion, promoting failure and risk taking, all of those things I think kind of play into what I'm trying to do. It's a little over ambitious right now. I'm trying to simplify it.
Tony, over ambitious? What? You're just ambitious. There's no over anything about Tony. For me, it made me rethink about everything I do differently. It made me rethink about the way I approach our podcast. It made me rethink the way I approach, my own creative work and the work that I'm writing. It has definitely made me reapproach the way that I am approaching my client work. I have a tendency to work with, not just a tendency, it's my model. I work with sales teams. And when I work with sales teams, sometimes as a sales manager for hire, right? I mean, where the managers fall short is their ability because of all the other things they're asked to do. I got off the phone with someone today. He's like, look, I'm running the show. My executive vice president is reading and running the reports. I mean, we're leading, but we're so drowning in data that we need someone to be able to actually develop our talent so we can grow our business. And so with that, I take on a lot of responsibility for a lot of people. And I forget who was authoring that particular section or chapter of the book, but reasonably, you can only lead 6 to 10 direct reports. So what that's made me think about is within a team, great. If I'm training 30 people in a month, or if at any moment now, there are 100 people on the sales team in the companies that I work with who could call me. My phone could ring with any one of 100 people. Well, I can't have 100 people be accountable to me. There just isn't enough time. So then for me, it's restructuring. And as I move into new client engagements, making sure that those boxes are checked ahead of time. Okay, what's the chain of command? I will interact with these people directly, but ultimately, who are they being held accountable to? Because it can't all be me. And so there's a lot of just different points that make me think about these things differently. So it was really powerful. And Jocko's voice is the first one I hear every morning when the alarm goes off. It's, you're going to get out of bed now, because
get out of bed, take a picture of your watch.
It's the first victory of the day is that discipline. Win the first thing of the day. And for me, this year has been about what are those most important priorities, and win them. Do right away. Win right away. Get your mind off on the right foot. Get your body off on the right foot. And, it makes me think really hard about that. And I've been chasing Jocko. I'll save that story for later, but not physically chasing him, but I've been in a little wormhole. But I want to talk to Christy first. I want to know what she's going to do before.
I was interested in your Jocko wormhole.
Oh.
So for me, I'm gonna use terms from the book, right? It's simple. I need to prioritize and execute. I need to stop doing a whole lot of stuff that I have been doing that has not been driving revenue in my business. And I need to prioritize the things that are going to be most important for the next 6 months. So it's getting laser focused for me. And this book had a wonderful structure. And I think I learned as much from the structure of the book as anything else, right? It was just being able to take some really complex elements and drilling them down to basics and stories.
Yeah.
It doesn't get much easier than that.
I agree.
So that's my takeaway. Simple, prioritize, execute.
Awesome.
It's going to be on the wall at some point, I promise.
Yeah, I think it should.
I might have to move the yes around somewhere. Yeah.
No, you can leave it right where it is and just fill in that space between your bookshelf and the bulletin board, and it just says simple, prioritize, execute.
Execute. That's it. There you go.
That's awesome.
And Jocko's face on the other side.
There you go.
For not
doing it. One big scary dude.
Oh my gosh.
I would just not.
He really is. He's not one I would want to necessarily meet in a dark alley.
So my first exposure to him, I heard he was interviewed by Tim Ferriss on his podcast, and that's where it all started, because Jocko was sort of invisible before that, and he tells a story. He's like a big jujitsu guy.
Yeah.
And he would these are freaking Navy SEALs. Like, these are human beings you do not want to freaking mess with. And he would have them come in one at a time and in sequence and just tap them out.
Yep.
Just one after the other, after the other, after the. If you are freaking tapping out Navy SEALs on a regular basis, I am not going anywhere freaking near you.
He's my height, and he's got me by 30 pounds, and he's a lot more solid than I am. And, I'm just looking at this guy. And, it's interesting. He's made me consider taking up jujitsu. He's not the first person to, but not because I have the interest in making anybody tap out. It's the discipline of doing something that you don't know, that you're no good at, and the discipline of training through it, and what you learn when you start from scratch and you develop into a master at something. And I've got a laundry list of excuses why I can't train jujitsu. You give me a minute and I'll come up with more. But, it's really made me reconsider that. And so I heard him when he guest hosted Tim Ferriss's podcast and took all the questions and answers. I haven't gone back to the original episode yet, but I've heard him twice on Joe Rogan's show. And part of the reason that I've chased it is, one, Joe Rogan, I think, asks good questions. For a guy who started out and in my opinion was just a meathead who was a comedian and made, told bad jokes and was just a guy's guy on the radio. He's really become somebody who asks really good, really insightful questions. And on one of the podcasts that he had Jocko on, he's like, this podcast has changed who I am. It's made me a completely different person. I'm more thoughtful. I've got a wider perspective on things because I just bring people in and I've learned so much. And there's a lot to be said about asking good questions and being curious when you're a salesperson. But I've also sought to chase Jocko Willink around on these podcasts as a means of testing whether or not he's a real human being. Like, does he laugh? Does he have any fun? Is he just a machine? Like, where does all this go? And I'm happy to say that he asks really good, insightful questions on his show too. And every show starts off really dramatic. There's no intro. Good evening. It's Jocko Podcast. I mean, like, it's so serious, and that's very clearly directed at his audience. I don't hold that against him, but it's kind of comical. And when you go to, there's a book that he wrote as a companion. It's the Discipline Equals Freedom Field Manual. And that book is actually available on iTunes. A chapter at a time is a track at a time. They're just a couple of minutes. And it's so like over the top serious. It's like, really, does this guy have a life? I mean, and I'm just, I think he actually does. But to hear him get into character, and if that's what's been drilled into him time and time again, then that's exactly who he needs to be. And I know some people who need him to be that in order to take anything away from him. So it's certainly not anything that it's certainly not anything I begrudge him. It's just I wanted to make sure there was a pulse, and I'm happy to report that there is one.
Well, I think it's safe to say that we are all big fans of Jocko and Leif, right? Or Leif, if I can ever get his name right.
Yeah, there's a muster in October in San Francisco.
Oh.
That they put on. It's essentially a workshop for the public, that they take all the stuff that they do privately for companies and they do it for the public. There's one in May in DC that I can't go to. And there's one in San Francisco in October that I've actually mentioned to a client. And I think it'd be very, very valuable for them to do this. But I think it's a really cool thing that they do.
Yeah, maybe we should have a mini muster in Austin in May. What
There
do you
you
think,
go.
Scott?
We'll get up at 3:30 in the morning and train.
I think
Yes.
it's on. I think it's on.
There you go. I think that needs to be like a little sub track for you. I love it. All right. Well, I think that we are right at an hour, and I think that that probably does it for this episode of the Why in the Buy Book Club, discussing Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. And thank you, Scott. Thank you, Tony, for joining us. This was awesome, as usual. I love these discussions. They really are incredible.
I agree. I mean, listen, anytime you get a chance to talk to someone other than me, it's got to be good for you.
I always like talking to you, Jeff. You're always so helpful with me with my business. So we have really, really incredible conversations, and we still have a ton of conversations that aren't recorded. So, but anyway, with that, we're going to sign off now. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. And Jeff, it sounds like Jocko and Leif certainly know their why.
Oh, and when you know your whys, your hows, and your mut, when you know your whys, your hows and your whats get much better. Yes. Yeah. So when you know your whys, your hows and your whats get much better. See, that's why I let you say that part. All the time.
Excellent. I like to turn the tables on you every now and then. That's funny. Okay, excellent. With that, we're going to stop our recording. Thanks so much, and everyone, feel free. Please join us next month. It'll be the last Tuesday of the month, and we'll send out the newsletter here in a week or so and give you the detail. We are holding the book for March very close to the chest. We have not decided what we're going to do with that yet.
That's right. So we're not telling anybody.
That's it. We'll give you a little bit of notice. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.